Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar introducing the big topic of sustainable trade and responsible business, brought to you by the Institute of Export and International Trade in partnership with the International Trade Centre. My name is William Barnes-Graham, the Executive Editor at the Institute, and I will be your host today. And what an important webinar this is. It was just under a week ago that the World Meteorological Organization published research showing that global temperatures could rise by more than 1.5 degrees Celsius compared to pre-industrial levels as soon as 2027. This was the latest alarming report and wake-up call to the fact that we are quickly approaching potentially catastrophic tipping points in the fight against climate change, leading to potential irreversible changes to the world as we know it. This webinar will hopefully introduce ways businesses can act responsibly in light of this, covering what sustainable supply chain and trade practices look like. And we're delighted to be partnering with the International Trade Centre, or ITC, on this webinar. ITC is the only international agency fully dedicated to the development of micro, small and medium-sized enterprises, working with partners to strengthen the competitiveness of small business exporters. It helps to build vibrant, sustainable export sectors that provide entrepreneurial opportunities, particularly for women, young people and poor communities. It was established in 1964 and is a joint agency of the UN and the World Trade Organization. Now, on the next slide, you'll see that today's webinar will consist of two panels. The first will introduce what we mean by sustainable and responsible trade, and the second panel will look at the role of standards and regulation for businesses looking to trade responsibly, and this will include voluntary initiatives for sustainability standards and mandatory regulatory requirements. There will also be a poll between the two panels to give our speakers a short halftime break. And I'm delighted to say that we have a truly world-class lineup of speakers across both panels, starting with, on the next slide, Shamina Amarsi, get my teeth back in, Shamina Amarsi, who is joining us for both panels and is a sustainability advisor at the ITC. Shamina has previously worked at Playtrade International and has worked as a sustainable development coordinator in the retail industry. She'll be giving us some context on the role of voluntary sustainability standards in moving towards more sustainable trade. Next up, we have Dr. Jason Clay, who's joining us from the World Wildlife Fund, or WWF, where he is a senior vice president. Jason has vast experience working with governments, businesses, researchers, NGOs, and many more organizations to drive improving environmental performance, particularly in food production and supply chains. He's also helped create global standards for producing and using raw materials and convened various platforms to reduce the impacts of production of various commodities, including soy and cotton. He will shortly be defining what we mean by responsible business and sustainable trade and is speaking on both panels. On the next slide, we have Dr. Gabriela Alvarez, a contributor on a number of ITC initiatives and currently the chair of the Trade for Sustainable Development Advisory Group. Dr. Alvarez teaches strategy on the executive MBA programs at the University of Lausanne and the École de Management de Lyon, and is also a founder or co-founder of a number of ventures involved in transforming cocoa farming and reforestation. She'll be shortly speaking about how to present a business case for sustainable trade. Next up. Next, we have Adrian Greet. Adrian is a vastly experienced sustainability practitioner, supporting a wide range of organizations to progress their own approach to sustainable and responsible business practices. He is a senior advisor for the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership and has previously worked for over 3 decades with Mars Incorporated, including as one of the leading architects of the Mars Sustainable in a Generation plan. Adrian will shortly be giving practical advice on how businesses can put their sustainability strategies into practice and is also appearing on both panels. Next up. Next, we have a regular on our webinar program in Professor Sangeeta Khurana, a professor in economics at Bournemouth University and the chair of the academic board at the Institute of Export and International Trade. Professor Sangeeta is currently providing trade policy support for a range of public and private organizations in the UK and overseas, and will be covering what assistance businesses need in order to adopt and implement sustainable business practices. Sangeeta is with us for just the first panel. And next, we have Dr. Matteo Fiorini, who will be joining us for the second panel. Matteo is a trade policy analyst at the OECD and is a fellow at the Robert Schuman Centre for Advanced Studies at the European University Institute. Matteo will be covering how international trade agreements could become the frameworks where regulatory requirements interact with voluntary sustainability initiatives. So a fantastic panel, I'm sure you agree. We will be sharing the slides with all registrants following the webinar, so if you'd like to read more about our esteemed panelists, you may do so afterwards. But on the next slide, before we get into the first panel, we're going to ask a quick poll to find out a little bit more about you, our audience. So we're here asking, how comfortable do you feel with the topic of sustainable trade and responsible business? And it's a scale between very comfortable and not at all comfortable. Just while you are answering that poll, just some housekeeping notes from me. Firstly, you can contact me with any comments or questions using the question panel, which is usually in the control window to the right-hand side of your screen. We hope to get to a number of your questions during both panels, but please note we cannot guarantee we will get to every question in the allocated time. As such, I'll be prioritizing questions that have relevance to the wider audience, so I won't be going into company or sector-specific queries as such. And please note that if your questions are short and clear, I am more likely to be able to read them. Finally, as already noted, you will receive a recording of the webinar with a copy of the slides in a follow-up email we will be sending over the next day or so. So I'm going to close that poll and share the results. Thank you everybody for responding. So a mixed bag, 45% of you saying neutral, so hopefully this webinar may move the dial a little bit, but around just under half of you as well, saying either very or quite comfortable, 11% not very comfortable, only 2% are still comfortable. So a mixed audience to say the least. Thank you everyone for responding. But on the next slide, we're going to get into the first panel discussion. And here we're going to be discussing what we actually mean by sustainable and responsible trade. Jason, if I could begin with yourself, two questions really. Firstly, how would you define responsible business and sustainable trade? And also, what would you see as the mega trends gearing towards sustainability that businesses should be looking out for?
So thanks for the questions, and it's nice to be on this panel. I look forward to this discussion. Let me just flip the questions around a bit, because I think the global trends are actually going to help define what a responsible business is going forward. So let's put that on the table first. Climate change is expected to reduce net primary productivity globally by 10 to 15%. That means that we're going to have to swim faster to tread water. With more people, more consumption, we're going to have to do more with less. We know we need to produce about 80% fewer greenhouse gas emissions, but we also need to use less land, less water. We need to produce less pollution. These things really need to be taken seriously by companies. We also have a population that is 8 billion now. It's going to be 9 billion in 15 years. It'll be closer to 10 billion by 2050. We haven't really seen the population decrease as people have told us it's going to. It's still going on, and I think we need to accommodate that. But with climate change, we're also going to see between 1 and 1.5 billion people displaced, according to most of the models. That is 1 in 8 people. That's a lot of people. That's you know, to just look around you and figure out how many that means in your life. We've seen global trade increase from around 7 or 8% of primary production in 1980 to 15% by 2000 to 30% by 2020. So it's almost doubling every 20 years or so. Fortunately, we appear to have peaked in terms of land use, and the amount of land that is actually being used to produce food is less. But unfortunately, we're still expanding onto new land, degrading it and throwing it away, and that's not a viable way to approach the future. We've got to figure out how to use less land in absolute terms and leave more of it to nature in areas where we're using it. Embedded emissions, people are becoming aware of this issue, and it means that supply chain management has to happen more than just in-time delivery. We have to understand what those risks are that are both legal, business, and reputational risks to companies. And finally, I think social media has, if anything, made transparency and traceability far more important than ever before. So now let me talk about what a responsible business might look like within this context. Well, first of all, it's and it's not either or. You still have to provide high quality products for your customers. You still have to keep your shareholders happy, and you still have to make sure that you can recruit and retain employees. All those things are business as usual. I think one thing that is a bit different, though, is that the emphasis can't just be on shareholders. Increasingly, in a finite world, we need to be focusing on where our products are coming from, where your suppliers are, and whether they are producing in a way that is more sustainable over time. Is the resource base that you depend on being maintained or improved through your purchases, or is it being mined? Because we can't have mining going forward. So companies need to know, responsible companies need to know where their suppliers, where do they source from? They need to know how the products are produced, where they're produced. And this is really more difficult than it might appear, because commodities have actually stripped all of this information out of products. And traders are very reluctant to bring it back in because they see it as proprietary. So we've got to address this issue about the difference between the amount of information companies need to be responsible and the amount they're given by the people they're buying from, not just tier 1 suppliers, but tier 2 and 3 and 4 and even up to 6 if you're talking about feed ingredients and animal proteins and things like that. We need to figure out how to align incentives along supply chains. Buying low and selling high is not going to be the future. We're all in this together, and we've got to figure out how to work together. Companies with their supply chains, making sure that they're protecting the natural resource base that they're going to need, not just tomorrow, but for the next generation and for generations after that. I think that we're also seeing that what is sustainable today won't be sustainable tomorrow. And companies need to begin to anticipate issues rather than react to them. Reacting is a very slow process in a very fast changing world. And those companies are going to not just be irresponsible, but probably out of business. Companies need to not just work with their supply chains, but they need to begin to look at sustainability as a pre-competitive issue, where they can work together with other companies, because we're all in this together. We're all buying the same things, we're all selling the same things, and we need to figure out how to do it in a way that maintains the resource base of the planet. The Global Salmon Initiative, a group of 17 companies that represent about 50% of global salmon aquaculture production, about 10 years ago decided to work together to reduce their key impacts and to become certified. Within 8 years, 50% of the production was certified. They had reduced fish meal and fish oil use. They'd reduced chemical treatment of sea lice by 90%. And they now have started to do the same for greenhouse gas emissions. They have a target of 50% reduction by 2030, and they've just completed an assessment of each of the companies' greenhouse gas emissions, and now they're creating a database so that they can share data about what actually works better. We need more sectors to start approaching sustainability in this way going forward. I think global trade is actually a more important issue than it's ever been before. And companies are going to need to work with producers to figure out how to cover the actual cost of production, the externalities that today are not included in prices. Comparative advantage is real, but the cost of production varies by geography, by producer, by commodity, and we need to reflect that, not just by having a very hard single price across the board. I think in order to do this, we're going to need some policy support to actually help move the bottom and help improve supply chains. One thing that I would offer is that the bottom 20% of producers produce 60 to 80% of the impact, but only 5 or 10% of the production. So we need to be focusing far more on the bottom than on the top if we want to change global trends. I spoke at a European dairy conference a year or two ago, and I said the thing they could do to improve the impact of dairy production globally would be to work with Indian and African dairy producers, not to improve European dairy. So I think we need to really figure out how we can address these issues more globally, how to think about them more globally. And the final thing that I'll offer, and then I'll stop, is that I think climate change is going to really complicate how companies purchase raw materials. We know about the chronic issues. You just mentioned that 27 may be a year where we actually are experiencing a 1.5 C temperature rise across the board. But this, with both chronic increased temperatures and also extreme events around the world that are happening, kind of like the coronavirus spread sporadically around the world and intensified in some places seasonally, etc. We need to figure out how to how this is going to complicate supply chain management for companies. They're not going to be able to invest in single supply chains. They're going to need supply chains on different sides of the world in different places to make sure they have products all the time. That means they can't know their suppliers as well as they did in the past, probably. They're going to need global systems to help reduce the key impacts so that they are comfortable, so that they don't have risk. And those systems don't yet exist. Those metrics don't yet exist. So this is all part of the challenge for global trade. But with global trade now is 30% of production, it's a challenge we need to get on quickly because, and it's not maybe as big as it sounds, because 15 to 20 countries provide about 90% of all the globally traded food. And so it's really not a huge number of countries, at least for the main part of this trade that we can focus on. Let me stop there.
I mean, I just had a message in from Adrian. I don't know if you've a really interesting question there. Do you want to come in?
Yeah, I mean, I think, Jason, thanks so much. And it's always great to hear these challenges, and I think you articulate them really well. I think for this audience and for many similar audiences, there is so much focus on sort of leading organizations, big players to drive the change, but ITC specifically works with SMEs. I've always felt there's a challenge on how to sort of utilize the SMEs to be part of the change. Have you got awareness of anywhere that's working well, where we've managed to get hold of some of the smaller organizations, and as a combined entity, they have an amazing opportunity to scale change?
Well, I think SMEs have much closer relationships to a lot of their suppliers because they tend to be local in many cases. I was just speaking with the IFC yesterday about the potential of SMEs in Brazil to begin to work with their producers, both the direct suppliers and the indirect suppliers for soy and cattle and leather and other commodities, to actually invest in assessing what parts of their properties are, let's say, marginal to production, where they're actually not making a profit. They're throwing money and inputs at regions that are simply underperforming. And if they took them out of production, they would produce more on less land with much fewer impacts and fewer inputs and fewer costs. And so is there a way to set up an entity to go around and provide advice to farmers about which areas are marginal, which areas are underperforming, which areas they could actually make more money selling carbon or selling stream flow or fresh water or other types of environmental services? One issue that I think needs to be really front and center here is that farmers need to get away from commodity production and to accompany that with the sale of carbon and other ecosystem services, particularly nature and corridors and things that are going to not just affect the global biodiversity or habitat and carbon, but also are going to affect productivity because they provide pollinators, because they reduce the impact of climate change on microclimates. We're seeing a lot of areas in Brazil that have been cleared that, because of the extent of the clearing, are not going to be viable. They're already getting hotter and drier than is useful for production. Production's beginning to decline. So those areas are going to have to be replanted. SMEs, I think, can be an SME to actually go in and help replant areas, working with communities. We've negotiated where local communities are actually replanting forest on ranches and on soy operations, where they they replant at a lower rate in exchange for collection rights in perpetuity for the non-timber forest products that are created from the trees they're planting. The ranchers and soy producers own the carbon and they own the trees, but the communities have the right to access the non-timber forest products and sell them on to other companies.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's really interesting, Jason. I think as well as the anticipate rather than react line is something which seems really interesting, because obviously the last few years supply chains have been so vastly impacted by coronavirus, the war in Ukraine, and closer to home in the UK, obviously Brexit's had an impact as well. I mean, to what extent do you think the last few years shows companies' abilities to change the way their supply chains work? Are there any lessons to be learned from the last kind of few years of disruption and change?
I think that one of the things that it's done is it put most of the CEOs and C-suite on hold from travel. And within months, they were kind of talked out with their local teams, and they started reaching out. And so the accessibility of CEOs was far greater than it's ever been, at least in my career. They wanted to talk, they wanted to know. The problem is we don't have platforms for them to share information. And I think that I've seen part of my role as being what I call the kind of the extrapreneur, the individual that talks to people who don't talk to each other, or put it more simply, the honeybee that cross-pollinates. I hear an idea here and take it someplace else. But NGOs shouldn't be filling this function. Companies should be doing it themselves. We need to set up learning systems where this happens and they're comfortable doing this. It's not competitive. That's why I talk about the Global Salmon Initiative, because I think this is a whole new way of doing business. These companies are super competitive in the market, but in sustainability, they cooperate. And this is coming from the CEOs. So now that all the CEOs are not talking to people anymore because they're traveling now and they don't have time, it's going to be interesting to see how much they actually learn from the pandemic and how that changes their behavior.
Thank you, Jason. I think this brings us on nicely, Adrian, onto questions on.
I just want to build on that point, Jason. I think that the crises have also opened up the realization of the need for a greater understanding of people's supply chains. I think people were trying to understand the supply chains, particularly with commodities, and it was challenging. But there's a realization you need to look beyond your own supply chains to who else your supplier supplies and what else your supplier supplies. You can focus, if you're a dairy milk buyer, you can focus on the milk and make sure you commit to that farmer. Many were. They were committing to continue to buy dairy from the farmer to ensure they were resilient. But the reality is the farmer was probably making more and a necessary profit from cheese and yogurts, which they weren't buying. And you therefore need to realize who else is my supplier supplying and what else do they need to ensure they're a resilient supplier. And I think it was a much better understanding that came out of that from the crises we've had to deal with COVID than people expected. And I think just hope we can retain that broader and better understanding.
Very important point. Thank you, Adrian. And I think it does lead nicely onto the questions I want to put to yourself, actually. And that's kind of around with the practical advice to entrepreneurs or business owners when it comes to putting a sustainable business strategy into action. And in the scoping course as well, we also spoke a little bit about nature-based solutions for businesses as well. So I wondered if you could talk about kind of the more practical side and the nature-based solutions as well, please.
Yeah, certainly. So again, I think you have to really build on what Jason's been saying about, you have to have the realization of the urgency of the challenges that are not just carbon specific, and it is a much broader church of challenges we need to manage. And there's a need for efficiency in your supply chains, a need for fairness in your supply chains, and a huge need for transparency. And then if you're going to be a responsible business or a sustainable business, you need to look at new market models. You need to reconsider what value is and how to apportion value in your supply chain and in your decisions. You need to consider mutuality and that anticipation that Jason talked about, and about the potential for success. Is you're going to need to think about collaboration as a key lever to pull to ensure you can make the progress you need. And I guess that for me, that whenever people talk about sustainability within the business, I said you have to start with a clear premise that sustainability is an anagram of say it as built in. And you're all going to go and write down say it's built in and move the letters around. It truly is an anagram of say it as built in. And until this is part of what you do every day, It's part of how you measure. It's part of how you reward. It's a part of how you remunerate. It's part of how you prioritize. It's always going to be bolt on. And it can't be, because if it's bolt on when there's a challenge on things like return or growth, then it gets bolt off very quickly, and that cannot be the future, and that's not sustainable for you as a business, because it won't work. So how do you do that? I think you have to be authentic in everything you're doing. Be honest about what you do know, what you don't know. Be honest about what you are going to action, what you're not going to action, because you can't do all of it. You can't do all of it now, and you can't do all of it alone. And except it's going to be iterative. You're going to be heading in generally a good direction, but you're going to move that journey as you learn more, as science changes, as new knowledge comes to the fore. And you need to think about materiality, probably above all else. You need to think about materiality, the relevance of that particular issue for you, and then the impact you can have, or the impact it has on you. You've got to always think about how big are you in that challenge. So you may be buying 0.0002% of something, but together with others, you may be bigger than you realize. But equally for you, this may be like 80% of the challenge you have to address. So how are you going to affect change in something that's big for you, but you can't actually define to your suppliers what they need to do? So really consider that strongly. And then work out what the role is you can have for yourself and for the sector as you go forward, either individually or together with others. So please do look to say it as built in. But do consider, and I think Jason highlights that this is a very complex issue, but it probably isn't that complicated if you start to make decisions and choices. You start to narrow where you focus your efforts, at least in the short and medium term. But sustainability is for me, a qualitative issue that we are trying to define quantitatively. And regulation and reporting and certification all want you to give them lovely numbers. Your big customers want to give you very simple numbers that show you're making the progress they need in their supply chain. But it is a very nuanced challenge. For me, I look at carbon as probably the more simple issue, because it's a global issue globally. Unit of analysis, we've all agreed, is the planet, and we can therefore offset from one area to another. That might lead you to the wrong decisions if you only focus on carbon. Sadly, you might decide to deforest something and decide to plant something somewhere else. Please don't do that. Think about what you can do to achieve bigger things. If you look at water as a challenge, it's a global issue locally. You have to consider the aquifer that you're relevant in. And how do you measure that? It starts to get exponentially more expensive to measure and equate the progress you're making or your current baseline. If you look at things like social challenges, they are local issues locally, down to individual people very often. That's even more difficult to validate and prove you're making good progress. And then nature, which I'll talk a little bit about, is sort of this sort of new kid on the block, but it really isn't. It's probably, for me, it's a local issue globally, because it has those attributes of needing to really understand how this works at a local level, and then extrapolating that to how you can achieve things more broadly across a whole landscape, or even more globally. And nature does tend to move. So when you think about how you're going to commit to things, you've got to think about how I'm going to sort of demonstrate the progress I'm making, and understand how challenging some of those metrics are going to be to ensure you make progress. And I guess for me, sustainability and responsibility haven't been best friends in the past, because we've looked at sort of sustainability very much through a carbon lens, a sort of metric lens. But responsible trade tends to look at those sort of social challenges and nature challenges to do more of the right thing, which are very difficult to quantify and measure. And often, if you have good data, it can encourage you to move away from a supply chain. And there's even regulation that's probably going to encourage you to do that too, which I think is the wrong direction. Because the more you know, sometimes the easier choice in your supply chain is simply to move to an easier region or a better supplier. But we need to work together to lift, as Jason said, lift the bottom to make sure that this works in the right way. And I think the challenge that many face, I think most face, is that we talk about commodities, and commodities, transparency and responsibility are not the best bedfellows. We want to have that stuff, but the challenge on getting that data together is really, really hard. So before I get into briefly on nature, I think if you're going to take practical action on being sustainable, you need to think about maybe being more purpose-led organization. And there's models out there like the Herman Daly model, If you've not seen that, have a look at that one. That's useful to think about how to reposition yourself in a different way. I would encourage you not to baseline. If you speak to a significant number of consultants, they will want to spend the next 2 years baselining where you were 3 years ago, or at which point you're still making no progress. So get a good state of the nation, get an understanding of your supply chain and where the big buckets are. And if you're a long way from a target, you don't need good metrics that are down to 9 decimal places. You need to make transformative change. That's big bets to make big change. You don't need to get down to decimal points. And then be really clear on the role you can play, the capabilities you have or need to have in your organization. And then look at collaboration as a real lever to pull together with others to achieve success. And why then nature? Well, nature is a really interesting one for me because I looked at a lot of areas and I think nature, to some extent like water, touches everything and is an enabler for that change. I'm going to offer a couple of things that Cambridge Institute talks about nature-based solutions as ways of working with natural systems to strengthen them while solving broader problems such as climate change, health, social inclusion, etc. And you can look at things like low tillage. Often low tillage is seen as a solution to reduce carbon at a farm, but it actually helps nature and it helps encourage the right root systems and the right biosystems beneath the soil to do well and progress, and from that you'll see significant increases in yield. And then the word many people will hear is nature positive, and this has been a big commitment from many businesses to be part of the nature positive program, which I fully endorse. But in short, a nature positive approach enhances the resilience of our planet and of our society. So if you can commit to progress on nature as one of the key areas, along with everything else, understand how it interacts with climate, how it interacts with social needs, health, well-being, and much more, I think you can make significant progress towards sustainability for yourself and for your own organization.
Thank you, Adrian. Some really important learnings there. I mean, I say it as built in, I think we'll take away. That seems very memorable, but also that kind of integrative approach seems really important, and also kind of understanding an organization's role within its sector and more broadly as well. Just wondering, is anyone else on the panel want to come in at all on what Adrian's just said there? On silence. I think I mean, it was fantastic advice. So thank you, Adrian. That was really useful. I hope everyone else has found that useful as well. Conscious of time, so I'm going to bring in Dr. Gabriela Alvarez now. So you've had invaluable experience in working with farming communities and in the upstream supply chain as well. So I'm just wondering, you know, from on the ground level, kind of what would you say is the business case for sustainability, especially considering there's a lot of businesses on the line today? So Dr. Gabriela, over to you.
Excellent. Thank you, William. Thank you for the invitation and a very interesting topic. And yes, I'm going to come, I guess, from Adrian's point on SMEs. I'm an SME in this, an entrepreneur in cocoa trading, but very tiny compared to all the giants. And we work with smallholders, with 2,000 smallholders in Colombia. So I'm right on that end, on the first mile, we call it, of this value chains. And maybe the first thing would be to react. I have an issue with sustainability as a word. It's not about sustaining the planet, it's about regenerating, about positive, need to improve, it's not just maintain. And one that touches my heart very closely is we cannot sustain poverty. Is very elastic, I would say, but we don't want to sustain poverty. We want to create prosperity. Jason talks about this and recruiting wages and how do we ensure the next generation. And at the current level in economics, that doesn't work. So we need to really change the gear into a more positive impact. So from that side, I guess from messages from the first mile, one of the things for companies that are looking into this is to look maybe at the two sides, the risks and the opportunities. And sometimes when we are a very small business, so to Adrian's point, how do we do it or what do? We can be a bit more agile. We do a lot of pilots. We try to be innovative. Our clients are so big for us that we go anywhere where the big guys have to go through 20 loops. We jump the next day and do whatever is needed. So from that side, SMEs in trade can be good partners in trying new approaches. Then you need the big guys to scale it up. Probably you cannot do it with only the small guys, but it's already an important thing And now one big thing that we come in is that the rules of trade are already set. So this is how commodities are traded, and you as an SME are not going to change the world system. How we present it sometimes to companies is, look, you can take this budget, not from your procurement budget, take it from your risk budget, from your insurance, because you could be facing big issues in the future. And this is something that you need to act now just to prevent that. Or take it from your marketing budget, because this could be creating new opportunities for you in terms of differentiation. And the third one, which I think it's increasingly important, take it from your human resources budget, from your training, building, recruiting, retaining people. More and more people are coming into companies now, and they want to demand, is this a purpose-driven company, like Adrian was saying? Are they going somewhere? Do they have an impact? Is what I'm going to do have a role? So I think it's broader, even within the companies, not just looking at it as procurement or just looking at where I buy, where I operate. So this is kind of the frame. And then the three big things I would say is, the first thing is to know and just understanding. We tend to be, and I liked, I think it was Jason, you mentioned that CEOs had time during COVID to talk and to learn. And it's true, we very often do not take enough time to look inside and to look at what's there. Take a trip, and now that you can travel with COVID, and go and see where the products come from, how does it look? We receive a lot of guests in our supply chains, and we make days with farmers and walks in the forest, and that is a lot more than a lot of these conferences. So this is a good step, first conference, but then go travel, go see, go learn and understand. The second part would be measure, and I liked Adrian. Yes, I agree, a lot of people are just like, how do we do the baseline? And we have such a huge leap to make that start looking at things that where you want to get to. But yes, important on measuring impact and results. And this I know we'll get into the next panel. But practices, good practices are great, but we can be forever in doing a lot of very good things and the impact might not be there. So we need to keep an eye on the impact. And then the third is act. There's an analysis, there can be an analysis paralysis. I know now with the carbon markets, this is an issue. Oh, is it really, really well measured? Is it really, really what's the science? There's a lot to be done, but there's a lot that needs to be done while we're flying the plane. We need to make the cockpit. So that's how it is. There's not enough time to do one and then the other one. On the knowing part, and this is the how to get to know, just a little bit of a couple of facts that I think are relevant in this discussion. One is on the economics, and we did an exercise on how much a cocoa farmer makes per year on net income, how much they have, and it's about $4,000 more or less. The living income, or what it means for a family to live, it's about 7,800 in this same environment in Colombia. So this is not about increasing productivity 10%. This is not, though it is part of the answer, selling a few tons of carbon. This is about thinking about the system. And this is just the income. This does not quantify, which Jason alluded and Adrian as well, the environment costs, the true costs. So not just the physical cost of what we're buying, but also the true cost. And just a small example, we're talking a lot about deforestation. The Economist published that what a farmer gets from deforesting is about 1,200. It's about what they get for the wood or for what they can plant or what they can make as a private. For the world, it's $25,000 worth in nature impacts. But who's bearing the cost of protecting that forest? The costs are being borne by the weakest link in our chain. The benefits are benefits for the world. So we need to connect those business models, the private smallholder that still has a gap to get to living income with a lot of the opportunities that this smallholder has to contribute to the world. And this is hard because I was looking at one book and it's about, like, in Wales, I was reading that farmers actually lose 33 pence for every kilo of lamb they produce. The business model does not work either. So there's a business model around food that is complicated. Apparently, they spend more time filling in a lot of the subsidies and the documentations and what needs to be done there, rather than economics working in the farm level. So this is not only a problem in developing countries and commodities. I think this is the food system type of challenge that we have. So these are some of the areas that I see. I think land use is a big thing. I think payment for environment services, we are doing very small little things. So in the traceability, we have product DNA, we have a small chocolate, and you can trace everything there to the farmer. And this is important, knowing where everything is coming from. And on nature, we're doing pilots. We plant trees alongside with cocoa farmers, very small. We just have 37,000 trees planted. In the world scale, nothing. But it's how do we progress in those models that help smallholders come into these topics. So that's a bit of the overview. My big last thing is to act. As I said, there's a lot of analysis, a lot of things, but we have to learn as we're doing. And that needs to be from a commodity and a product and a trade, which was our traditional model, to a cooperation, to value networks, to bring in the NGOs, to bring in the academics, to bring in the pre-competitive, and from products to solutions, and from practices to impact, and from commodity trading to integrated solution seeking. So that would be my 2 cents for this. Looking forward to the next part of the discussion.
Thank you, Gabriela. I mean, one of the things which comes to mind for me is there's some really important points about SMEs being positioned to take more risks and to be a bit more agile and so on. But a lot of what we're seeing in the UK context, the UK is by no means necessarily the weakest link in the chain on these issues. But a lot of UK SMEs are very squeezed at the moment and are in a difficult position to take risks or to invest in kind of new ventures and new kind of innovative solutions. So just what would you say to kind of those companies at the moment who are sort of grappling with the cost of living crisis and all that sort of stuff at the moment?
Sorry, your question is about the living. Could you?
So just, yeah, to UK SMEs who are grappling with squeezed costs at the moment, and obviously it's a really positive message about taking risks and making the most of your agility. But what would you say to those companies who maybe feel as though they're under a lot of pressure and feel as though they've struggled to do that?
That it's your survival. I think it's very tough. The only way you can survive as an SME is by differentiating and by doing something that the big guys cannot do. So if you're just trying to do what the big guys can do and a little bit cheaper, you will be in that squeeze all the time. So you need to understand or try to get to, and this is ITC does a lot of this type of practices, is how can you differentiate your value and integrate into the supply chains better so that you become more relevant to your buyer and you can command some differentiated trade. If not, it's very hard. You don't have the economies of scale, you don't have the people, so you need to find different ways on how you as a company sustain yourself.
Adrian.
Yeah, I want to build on what Gabriela was saying earlier, and I think the challenge is that there's a saying, isn't it, that culture trumps strategy for breakfast. So unless you've got the right culture in your business, it doesn't matter what strategy you deploy, they won't actually resonate and deliver the change. So you need to be sure the culture you've got is the right one and be the business you want to be. But you have to realise that the pressures you're feeling in your business from cost, etc., the sort of social pressures, they trump everything. And I think Jason talked about the displacement that's going to be happening with 1 in 8 people. Those sorts of social challenges are absolutely going to be what affects change. The reality was in the UK, we were going to have a prevention of buy one, get one free from some less than healthy products, which got ceased immediately. There was concerns over food poverty. So a social challenge trumped a good initiative that we therefore didn't deploy, and that's what's going to happen. So what Gabriela is saying is right. Look at how you want to achieve the changes needed and where it is funded from. If you fund this from your HR budget, it is because you want more people to come and work for you. And there's big studies on the cost of churn in an organization. They are significant, and they're not really measured or tracked, and particularly in small and medium enterprise and entrepreneur businesses, because they're not got those systems in place. But that's where the reality is. It's about utilizing those available funds for investing in your future. So I think you've got to look at this differently and understand how you can pull those levers to achieve the change, but utilize them to bring the right people into your organization. That might be a way to consider how you deal with those squeezed challenges.
Totally agree. Very good point.
Thank you both. That was a really interesting part of the conversation. And this comes on, I guess, with businesses who are newer to this, who are kind of earlier on in their kind of journey towards becoming a more responsible, sustainable trading company. I mean, Sangeeta, if I can bring you in at this stage, what assistance do you think these businesses will need in terms of adopting and implementing some of the sustainable business practices which are being mentioned by Adrian and Gabriella? And but I completely agree with the point earlier. It's not just sustainable, but it's regenerative and it's positive, proactive as well. And what do you see as the role of international trade in this shift as well?
Thank you so much, and thank you to the panelists. What an interesting discussion. Wow, very rich discussion, so thank you so much. Thank you for the question about businesses and international trade. I think I would like to answer this from the perspective of global value chains that I work on. Because within the context of global value chains, there's a lot of discussion about the environmental and social risks. Like greenhouse gases, hazardous waste, poor working conditions. But then you see, it's very important to mention here that when we are looking at this problem, we need to start thinking about what are businesses doing themselves to be able to address the problem that they face at the moment and how they can be sustainable. I think one way forward is having a responsible business conduct, which essentially, and this is for businesses, to be integrating and considering the environmental and social issues throughout the supply chain and also their business operations. So the sustainability has to be across the supply chain, as Jason was alluding to earlier. Now, let me go back again to the global value chains, and let's remember that GVC is where we were talking about supply chains all the time when COVID hit. It is so the world has been, so trade has been linked with global supply chains, but it is only recently we've started understanding the importance of supply chains within the context of international trade. And it is here, I think it's important, we need to start embedding sustainability norms within supply chains, because remember, within a supply chain, there are n number of suppliers, from the first level to 6-7 levels of suppliers, small and big. They can start embedding sustainability norms. So it is not only sustainability we need to think of, but we also need to be thinking about resilience and how we can ensure that risks can be managed. Because within global value chains, it is not only COVID we have to think of, but we think within the context of COVID a lot. We have to think about the geopolitical tensions, the risk of cybersecurity attacks, in addition to climate change. So within this context, we need to be thinking about, yes, what are the sustainability concerns we need to be incorporating into our supply chains? And it is within this context that we are talking about sustainability considerations and the responsible business conduct. We are placing it at the heart of business operations because it is a concept of risk-based due diligence that is increasingly emerging as a tool to mitigate the actual and potential adverse environmental and social impacts from business operations, including throughout the supply chain. So businesses have to start thinking about incorporating responsible business conduct within their supply chains, and also having shared standards and practices on the responsible business conduct. Because without that, it will not be possible to facilitate trade, promote trust, and ensuring sustainable supply of goods. Now, having said this, it's important to mention here that not only businesses, but governments are also thinking about the responsible business conduct at a broader level. And if you look at trade agreements that are being done and trade and investment policies that are being rolled out by governments, we see that there's an emphasis to integrate and implement the responsible business conduct provisions within trade agreements, say for example. And we say that these instruments will really actually go a long way encouraging businesses both home and abroad to observe common standards. Having said this, it's important to mention that countries are now going down the path of domestic legislation, and the responsible business conduct applies primarily, as I would like to allude to the example of critical minerals, because it's a key element of clean technology, and it is really essential to advance the transition to a low carbon economy, and hence the concept of the responsible business conduct is really important. And within this context, I would like to allude to the recent regulation by the EU on conflict minerals, which includes due diligence requirements for EU-based importers of tin, titanium, tungsten, gold, from the top of my head. Just to sum up, I know we are against time. I think, sustainability basically requires a long-term commitment from businesses. And it takes time for businesses to see and benefit and reap the rewards of this. So sustainability today seems to be a big challenge, one that matters beyond individual companies. So it is collectively we need to start thinking about incorporating sustainability in business practices. The good thing is that a large number of companies are actually looking forward and talking about and incorporating sustainability policies within the agenda of international trade. It is clear that sustainability is a mega trend and it's simply not going to go away. I'm conscious we are against time, so I'm happy to come in and answer any questions if there may be any. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sangeeta. I mean, I just have interest. I mean, obviously, you've got a role at the Institute as the chair of the academic board, and obviously working one of the universities. So, what role do you think there is for education and training and just kind of skills building in this space as well?
Thank you so much. William, as the attendees know, that the Institute of Export and International Trade is also a learning academy that basically partners with governments and with organizations, and also we partner with ITC to deliver courses. So basically, we are delivering these training programs to professionalize international trade at national and international level. And we are also co-partnering with the Online Customs Academy, which is the first training platform dedicated to customs skills. So I think this is where, given that businesses are increasingly recognizing the importance of sustainability provisions within business operations and supply chains, this is where we seem to be heading for, because we would be very keen to roll out qualifications which look at the business conduct within the context of supply chains, primarily looking at sustainability concerns, environmental, social concerns as well. Thank you. I hope that answers.
I'm sure it does. Thank you, Professor Sangeeta. I'm just wondering, any of your panelists, would you like to interject at all at this point? Doesn't look like it. I am conscious of time. There's been some really good comments coming through from fellow panelists and the audience actually throughout this session. So I'm conscious of time. So I want to move on to the next bit, which is Shamina. And Shamina, you're here to talk about the role of voluntary sustainability standards in all of this as well. And so what role do you think this has in the kind of overall sustainability movement, but also international trade more broadly?
Yeah, thanks, William, for the question. Thank you, everyone, for this great panel. It's extremely interesting. Just to respond to that question and to this concept of sustainability that we're talking about, I know that Gabriela mentioned also earlier that maybe the concept is not exactly defined as it should. I would like just to take a bit of a step back and look in the past, although we've been mentioning a lot of, many panelists have been mentioning the urgency of the situation and the fact that we are looking forward, but just to take a bit of step back and thinking about this history and what we are talking about when we talk about voluntary standards and standards in general. The idea, the point is that we will not go too far in history, but just to reflect about the root cause and the very reason why those such standards have been existing and developing was because of the need to cater for the fragmentation of the supply chains, the movement of globalizations that started decades ago. There was a concern that was growing together in parallel with that movement, saying that actually trade liberalization and globalization of supply chains and those fragmentation does not necessarily equal with environmental and social protection. On the contrary. So with those growing concerns, civil society organizations have come together and started to put together sort of codes or norms on how to trade sustainably. And this has become a trend. This has proliferated. There are a lot of standards that have come to birth after that, each of them really specifying into their sector, into their topic. I know that we mentioned the topic of living income, for instance, social issues, environmental issues, and there have been a sort of a plethora of standards that have been developing. But I would like to say that sometimes when we define those standards, we need also to take maybe a broader lens and think about all type of standards. What does it mean exactly? It means a code. It means an audit protocol. It means a company sourcing guidance. It's very large. And that is why also at ITC, the initiative of indexing and deep diving into the world of standards have been started almost more than a decade ago with the creation of the standards map to give a bit of guidance on who the standards are, what do they do, and how business can actually work with them. We've talked, the panelists before have talked a lot about the positive aspect and the agility of SMEs and both their vulnerability, the sense of emergency that they have to deal with on a day-to-day basis, but their agility and their ability to adapt. But to adapt and to be agile, you have to know, and to know you have to be able to be guided through the plethora of initiatives that exist, and that is why also this initiative like the standards map is existing to promote that, to explain that, to navigate that. Now, from ITC perspective, what we've been observing also those past years, and we don't have a crystal ball, but thinking also that the future is that those norms are coming to a point where they are collaborating more with each other. We've been observing more and more sectoral collaboration. I know that the word collaboration has been used also a lot as a need for striving and to move forward. So at the industrial level, at the sectoral level, there have been a lot of ways and collaborative platforms that have been existing to actually, for business to actually talk together, being in the same sector or having the same sector or being in the same supply chain. And ITC is trying also to foster the dialogue actually and trying to put SMEs in connection with bigger brands actually to be able to work together for more transparency and more credibility. So this is where potentially standards continue to have a role, but a role that I would say that is not I think one of the panelists was talking about the need to be driven by purpose, but the need also to move away from baseline and actually to be driven by a sort of a sense of ambition. And I would say that if standards continue to have a role, it would be a role actually to foster not a race to the bottom, but a race to the top. So really trying to make that leap, make that advancement to be able to try and address the appalling issues that have been described by the panelists, be it on the social level, on the climate change level, and on the global level. So yes, that can be the role that sustainability standards can continue to play, and we've been observing a lot of those collaborative movements and those possibilities actually for SMEs and different supply chain actors to actually have a say, expose transparently actually their processes, their possibilities. But I would say, and I would also use again, I'm trying to be also mindful of time, but I would like to use again, stress also a word that has been used by Adrian, I think, is the word authenticity. The authenticity means also being true to what you can do and what you cannot do as a business. And we know that at the moment there's a big legislative push also to actually foster corporate social responsibility further to the point where it's not voluntary anymore, it's being legal and it's been a norm that is imposed there. But we see also that the standards can also bring light on parts of the risks assessment that can be done and cannot be done. So to put it in other words, it's absolutely fair and normal when you are dealing with very complex supply chains to say that you can't know everything, that you can't deal with every issues at a time. You have to think, be ambitious, think largely, but at the same time, take one issue at a time and say that if you want to address a particular issue in the part of this supply chain and be very humble and saying for this part I don't know, then don't hesitate to liaise with your counterparts, with organizations that exist there which are able to actually shed light. And that is very important also for SMEs to know, because we've been talking about the use and the sound use of resources and which budget to take from to invest into corporate sustainable responsibility. At the same time, it's not possible to invest in everything, and this is where partnerships are extremely needed. There are also lead brands who have the possibility to invest also in supply chains and to help SMEs actually to map their own suppliers, to know their sectoral risks, for instance, to map that and to be able actually to identify the issues rather than having to reinvent the wheel. So less duplication, more collaborative effort, and I would say also, and I think we will talk about that in the next panel also, the narrative between what is mandatory, what is voluntary. We'll talk about that, but I would say that there's also an important concept that has to go with time, and I have impression that it was also said through all of the interventions. I think Dr. Clay, Jason mentioned that we have no time. The sense of emergency is there. The figures are appalling. At the same time, we also said, Professor Sangeeta Khurana was also saying that it takes time actually to measure an impact and to see time. We need sustainable and lasting relationship and business relationship to be able to see the return for investment and to see whether the return for investment in terms of purpose driving business is working or not. Social issues, it takes a lot of time. It takes a whole generation actually to see whether the investments have been working. So I would say that there has to be a reflection in terms of time and agility there when we talk about sustainability and when we talk about standards. So I know that we are limited in terms of time, so I won't go further, but happy to continue in the next session.
Thank you, Shamina. And yeah, conscious of time, so unless any of the panelists does want to interject at this stage, we are going to go into this topic in a bit more depth in the next panel. So I will probably in the next slide move to the halftime poll, so I can give our speakers a short break. So I'm going to launch this poll, and it follows on one of the things Sangeeta was touching on earlier. So it's just gauging. Would you be interested in further educational support around the topic of sustainable trade and responsible business? Sangeeta, just before you go, because I know you're going at this point, but just wondering if you could say just a little bit more actually about what the Institute is looking to do in this area. You're on mute.
William, can you please repeat the question?
So just in terms of the question around this poll question we're asking at the moment, which is gauging an interest in further educational support around this topic of sustainable trade and responsible business. I was just wondering if you could say a little bit more about what the Institute is looking at doing around this topic in the future.
Thank you so much, Will. for the benefit of viewers, what we are planning to do is, so that the viewers may be aware that we have qualifications at several levels, starting from level 4, 5, 6. And we are actually building on the different qualifications that we have. So far, we do not have a qualification on sustainable trade and responsible businesses. And we are actually hoping to start one which looks at sustainability concerns, looks at how businesses can incorporate ESG requirements within the supply chain and business operations. And we just thought it would be of interest to ask the participants whether they would be interested in pursuing a qualification along these lines, because based on the feedback, we would then take it forward and reach out to international experts to roll out a qualification on this at several levels, again, going back. And this would be a part-time qualification which would allow businesses to nominate their staff who can attend and do all the coursework within their time. And for that, we would give credit and obviously a certificate at the end of the year. Thank you so much, William. I hope that helps.
Terrific. Thank you, Sangeeta. That's a great overview. And actually, it's really encouraging to see in response to that poll, 82% of you would be interested in this. So that's really good to see. Lots of interest. Maybe the 18% of you are already on top of this anyway. But no, thank you everyone for responding to that poll. And thank you to our panelists on panel 1. So Sangeeta.
So if I may add, thank you so much to the attendees for such an overwhelmingly positive response. You will hear from us very soon because we will get busy with our experts, and you will hear from us soon. Thank you so much.
Terrific. Thank you, Professor Sangeeta. We are going to move on to the second panel, so I'd like to thank Sangeeta for her time today and to welcome Dr. Matteo Fiorini, a trade policy analysis from the OECD, along again with Shamina, Jason, Adrian and Gabriella, who are all returning from the first panel. And we're here looking at the session is looking at voluntary sustainability initiatives and mandatory regulatory requirements, which we touched on. The first part about we touched on at the end of the last panel. Shamina, if I can come back to yourself, I was just wondering, when ITC works in building the capacity of small businesses in developing countries and LDCs to improve their competitiveness and create market access, what kind of support and tools are you offering to small businesses to adopt sustainable approaches?
Thanks, William, for the question. So as you said, it's actually ITC's mandate to really support small and medium enterprises in developing countries, actually to be part of the supply chain, but be part in a sustainable way, in an inclusive way, and in a way that is fostering long-term business relationship. So what ITC does is there are different kind of intervention that ITC does to partner with SMEs actually to bring more capacities, and it has a lot to do with knowledge and information sharing. The development can be noted. ITC is developing a lot of, I'm going to turn my video off, maybe the sound will be better. I will try that. And I'll continue just to explain that ITC is developing a lot of global public tools, the tools which are available online, which are informing the different audiences and the SMEs on market data, on information general in supply chains, also on standards and existing regulation that are there and how they work together, but also has created different platforms for actually SMEs to be able to connect with different business partners, with creating what we call their sustainability profile and be able to find new connection and also be able to display and explain the work that they do in terms of their business model, but also in terms of the work that they do. If we take the example, for instance, of textile supply chains, where we know that there are a lot of social and compliance audits happening there, which are being mandated by for different reasons and different grounds. If as an SME, as a small factory, you have done such an audit, you are able to connect to those global public tool that ITC has created and to actually showcase the work that you have done the idea is not necessarily to show, it's actually to connect and actually not to have to go through such a process again, avoid the duplication of efforts, and so that you can concentrate on your business and on your activities. So this is really what ITC is trying to promote as much as possible, the connectivity and the avoiding the duplication, and try to find more efficiencies into the sustainability work. So there are a couple of tools that have been developed, as I mentioned, but also a whole chunk of the work that ITC does with small and medium enterprises actually to conduct training and an awareness raising session, and also e-learning, also not only to SMEs themselves, but also to the business organizations actually who work with SMEs. So actually, at ITC, the department, the program I work for is called Trade for Sustainable Development. So it's very related to the topic of this discussion in this panel. But the mandate of this program is really to create more, or to give the possibilities of SMEs to have more access, more informed access to the different markets, to the possibility, to the opportunity for diversification. But there is a lot of work that is done that is equally important, and not necessarily directly targeting the SMEs, but also targeting all the players that are also around the SMEs and who are there to support the SMEs. So it's a work that is done a bit in the coulisses, so to speak, if we use the word coming from the theater world, but to say that there's a lot of work that is done also by ITC to actually engage policymakers, to engage larger brands in order to be capacitated also themselves with tools and with knowledge to understand the requirements that they have in terms of sustainability. It's equally simple and complex. Those are very complex issues, but at the same time, it's a very good sense. But sometimes this good sense is not so easy to have when you deal with very, very complex supply chains. So ITC is trying to make those connections and also to inform also policymakers and business operators. I know that in the previous panels, we've been talking also that the consciousness at the top of an enterprise is very important, also at the CEO level. So bringing this awareness of what's happening on the ground, what are the issues there, and what are the solutions there. So the mandate is really solution-driven and practical solution-driven, and most of the time the solutions are, like I said, very good sense, and coming from the bottom most of the time, coming from the field, and it's not that they don't exist, it's just that they need a bit of light and a bit of scaling up and a bit of highlight, and I think that ITC is trying to do, also giving a voice to those solutions and those good practices that are there. Not everything is perfect, but there are good practices that are there, and those are good learnings there. So I would say that this is the way ITC is trying to promote this.
Thank you, Shamina.
And I will stop there. Yeah.
No, that's great. It's a really great overview, and it's I guess raising awareness of some of the initiatives which are out there seems to be absolutely fundamental. There's a lot out there though, so that's, I guess, part of the challenge as well. And that brings us on to Jason. I mean, we've seen a proliferation of sustainability standards over the years. There are varying standards which exist, as alluded to, but could there be a global minimum environmental standard? And could you tell us a little bit as well about your work on the Codex Planetarius as well?
So WF and I have been involved in the development of a number of different sustainability standards over the years. I think there are, last count, at least when I lost count, maybe 500 different standards around food alone. And there are probably a lot more if you look at local standards or regional standards. They don't measure the same things. Many of them are practice-based rather than measures. They create confusion. There's competition in the marketplace. But perhaps the biggest thing that they have done is create awareness about problems. They have created consensus about what the key impacts are. And I think the better ones have actually developed common metrics and methods and boundaries for measuring those impacts. But the biggest issue is that the ones, is that they're often based on practices, that they're voluntary, that they're often dominated by US and EU markets, which are no longer dominant in the world in many ag commodities. But not just the markets, but also the thinking is dominated, I think, or has been dominated by US and EU markets. The biggest issue for me, though, is that voluntary standards simply didn't reduce the key impacts of any global commodity, because they actually rewarded the best producers rather than moving the rest of the producers or moving the bottom. As I said before, the bottom 10 to 20% of producers cause 60 to 80% of the impacts. And by impacts, I'm talking about things like habitat loss, biodiversity loss, water take, water effluent and pollution, soil health, greenhouse gas emissions, even agrochemical toxicity. So we have decided that let's take a different approach. Let's look at not at voluntary standards, but at mandatory standards that could become part of the WTO. That it would be Codex Alimentarius is kind of the precedent for this, about protecting the health and safety of people through global trade and verification that products meet minimum phytosanitary health and safety issues, etc. Codex Planetarius is intended to set minimum environmental performance standards for the production of food that is traded globally in the same way. So the basic belief of this is that global trade shouldn't undermine the natural resource base of exporting countries, and that if there are impacts from producing exports, the consumers in those countries should be covering those costs. So while we're focused on Codex Planetarius as a government-to-government trade agreement and eventually, hopefully, part of the WTO, it can't just be about sticks. It's also got to be about some carrots. What are the incentives to make this work? And the more we've thought about this, we're seeing that the real cost of production is just not included in today's prices. So we're beginning to look at what a 1% environmental levy or payment would look like on all exports of globally traded commodities, starting with a proposal to look at doing this in Brazil related to deforestation-linked commodities, to show how this would work, how it could actually use the market to make the investments that are necessary to make food production more sustainable. If you look at Brazilian exports for soy alone, 1% of the value of soy exported from Brazil is $330 million a year. There is no certification program, no trader, no company that's going to be making that kind of investment. I think what we're looking at is, how do we use global trade to finance the investments that are going to be needed, not just to make it more sustainable today or address issues like deforestation, but also more resilient tomorrow? How do we include these externalities into a pricing mechanism that actually makes this work? It's not a tax, it's actually consumers paying, and this money, the guarantee of this would be that this kind of money would be 100% of it would go back to fixing the problems, either directly with farmers as grants, not as loans, and they would have to report on the results that they have created or achieved through these grants. If not, then they would have to repay it as a loan. And so the idea is to really figure out how to use the market to change it. But we need to have this not be a voluntary program. All the boats need to rise. Everybody needs to be affected by this. It can't just be that the better companies are doing this and the worst companies get a free pass to do whatever they want, or exporters or importing countries as well. So that's the short of it, because I think we're a little bit behind in our schedule. I'll stop there and happy to answer any questions. This is still in a proof of concept phase, so there's a lot of research projects looking at what the impact of this would be on small farmers, on income, on the product that's not exported, how much you would actually need to cover some of these costs, how long it would take to make some of these systems more resilient, etc.
Gabriela, did I see a hand?
I know we're short time, but an export levy or an import levy? Because export, you're still on the exporting country, and if it's closer to the consumer, then maybe then you can redirect that to farms around the world and where the needs are. An export levy might put at a disadvantage the exporting country. So I know maybe this may not be the forum to talk about it later, but yeah, this jumps
But let me
out.
answer that specifically, because I think it is on the FOB price. So it is on what is the price at the point of export, which would then be passed on to the consumers. It would be put into a separate fund where there has to be accountability that's both from the local exporting country, but also from the importing countries, because they're actually paying this fee and they need to see results. So it has to be transparent. In Brazil, we're looking at something like the Amazon Fund as a model, but with a lot speedier results and a lot more nimbleness in terms of how to distribute the money.
So I think it's Jason, obviously the WTO is an organization for creating kind of multilateral agreements and stuff like that. I mean, it takes years, doesn't it, to do anything at a WTO level? Is there an inherent challenge in this approach, in that obviously it's a short timeline we've got ahead of us, but we're talking about institutions would take a long time for change to be implemented?
So we're doing 6 pilot studies to look at exactly how this would work. We're doing this in compliance with the WTO guidelines for setting standards. It's interesting to note that no entity has actually ever set standards for the WTO that have been adopted by them. They've always existed, like Codex Alimentarius, already before the WTO was created. So this is a bit new territory for everybody. I think it needs to be started with bilateral trade agreements, and then maybe with countries, both either exporter or importer. I mentioned that 15 to 20 countries are responsible for most of the global trade. If they want to continue to be doing that, they can't be mining their resources. So they also need to have this kind of a rule in place that allows them to have the legal ability to force these environmental costs to be included in pricing. And we've got a very blunt stick right now because we don't know what it will actually cost. But it's a good start. And this kind of system we're going to need even more as climate change causes a lot of impacts on the ground that we have not yet even identified, much less are anticipating.
I mean, if I could bring in Matteo at this point. I mean, Jason just alluded there to trade agreements, and I mean, I was just wondering to what extent trade policy, and more specifically trade agreements, could be viewed as a framework where regulatory requirements interact with voluntary sustainability initiatives. What are the challenges here for this to be effective, and can transparency of voluntary initiatives play a role in maximizing effectiveness in these interactions?
Yep, thanks a lot, William, and thanks everyone for the great conversation. Indeed, I do believe that given the all the potential and the issues around voluntary sustainability standards and voluntary sustainability initiatives, the potential avenue to fix the issues and maximize the benefit, their potential, is through the interaction between some kind of regulatory framework, some kind of public policy, and trade policy is a natural landscape to test this type of interaction. What Jason was discussing about the possibility to use to integrate standards into regional trade agreement, bilateral trade agreement, is to my view a very good territory to make these tests. And the question then is what do we need to know about voluntary sustainability initiatives to integrate them into a trade agreement, and to which purpose do we want to integrate them? I think from a research perspective, we have been doing some work together also with ITC, and leveraging the great resource that Standards Map database is, to understand, for instance, how transparency of voluntary sustainability initiatives varies in this broad, heterogeneous, and fast-changing population of voluntary sustainability standards, under the assumption that transparency could actually be one of those key characteristics, key features of voluntary initiatives that public policy need to require when there is this interlinkage, when there is this interaction with voluntary sustainability initiatives. And looking at the data, we actually found that transparency, as captured by the level of information disclosure on different aspects of the activities of voluntary sustainability initiatives, is pretty heterogeneous. And on standard setting, on dispute settlement, on implementation, models of information disclosure can be very different. They can be very shallow, or they can be very deep. You know, this provides, I think, a sense of how complex and heterogeneous the landscape is, and also the challenge for trade policy to design good models to use to interact with the sustainability initiatives in order to maximize the achievement of sustainability objectives. So let me stop here and to leave also space for discussion.
Thank you, Matteo. I mean, I'll offer the floor to the panelists. Does anyone want to come in on that at all? Jason.
I think that the issue is that ideally we would want to have a set of global standards that become required by importing countries that are not, then we have a common set of metrics, a common set of methodologies, a common focus, which is not just one issue, as in the EU deforestation law, where we haven't even defined forest, much less all other kinds of habitat conversion. And so I think that if we go down the route of a global set of standards, they're going to have to be mandatory. And when Codex Alimentarius started, only 18 countries signed off on it. And then over time, and as it was adopted by the WTO, 188 countries have signed off on it. And now it's even used for domestic production. I think those kinds of that is probably in the future for this. But again, as was said earlier, this is not a short-term thing. This is a longer-term process that if we can create a pathway now and understand the implications and do the research that backstops this kind of thing, we can help make this happen faster when there is political will to do that. We're not there yet. But without having an idea of where there might be, I think we could spend a lot of time looking for it.
It's interesting, there's a level of precedent for it in the trade world with the trade facilitation agreement in terms of that paving the way for kind of the streamlining of customs processes and borders. And you know, that agreement was signed many years ago, but it's starting to come through. I think this week there's a big EU customs reform. There's lots of reform going on in the UK context, where you're kind of seeing more digitalization and standardization of customs processes across different borders. So, I mean, I guess if there is a precedent in a more recent precedent there, then hopefully that's something which you know, can be replicated and hopefully expedited in this context if this is the route we go down.
I think it should be also mentioned that the WTO, we've been in discussions with them, and they're very specific that this needs to be results-based and performance-based, not practice-based. The reason they rejected Europeans' proposal for farm to fork was that it was based on organic standards, which were practice-based, not performance-based. And so I think that's precisely why we need something that is broader that is going to be addressing the 6 to 8 most important impacts. And I named the environmental ones, but there's others that probably ought to be in there, like legality. I mean, there's good evidence that maybe 50% of globally traded food is not produced legally in the country of origin. That's a little bit of an issue. Now, we might argue about how illegal it is, but still, illegal is illegal. The other issue is around food loss and waste. Should a country be allowed to import food if they're wasting 40% of it? You know, these are issues that we need to start thinking about, because to manage this planet, we've got to reduce waste. We've got to food waste. We've got to begin to set in place systems that are going to help us get where we need to be with 10 billion people consuming more.
This is absolutely fascinating, I have to say. I mean, also conscious of time again, and also conscious of it being a very UK audience, I think, from the data I looked at before the webinar. So I was wondering, to bring Adrian in at this stage, we've heard a very kind of global picture, but in terms of a UK context, could you give some insight into the British regulatory landscape and its push towards sustainable trade and a nature positive economy?
Yeah, I'm not going to say some very nice things now, I guess. I think the one thing though from the discussion so far is that this is so urgent. We've got to get behind big transformative changes. And the Codis Planetaris is exactly what we have to do. It's that scale of change we need to have across all supply chains globally in order to affect the sheer scale of challenge and sheer urgency of action. And we're not going to get there. We're not, sadly, going to get there through voluntary or current regulatory requirements, because you're in the UK, you're in a global world anyway. There's no way you have to only address UK approaches. You have to consider European ones, which rightly have been rejected by WTO in certain areas that are too definitive about what the outcome is, what the approach is for success, rather than the outcome that's needed. And whether that's a European market you're stepping into, whether it's a sector you're a part of, there will be some voluntary or mandatory requirements you have to also take account of. So you've got to look at the UK, but you have to also look at what's happening globally, depending on what market and markets you're in, because they're all different. There was a point earlier that they may be common. I don't believe they are. I don't believe they're going to be getting anywhere close to common in a short time frame. So things like Codis Planetaris are absolutely the right way to go. But let's talk about the UK. There's a lot of things that are out there that are going to put pressure on the UK. And I feel very bad now because I'm going to be disingenuous in two ways. The UK Environment Act from 2021 was created under the support of George Eustace, a fellow Cornishman, so I should be very supportive of him. And the legally binding targets that were set in December 2022 were set by Therese Coffey, who's an ex-colleague of mine at Mars, so I should be very supportive of those as well. I think for me, that's the problem. These actual targets they're setting in the UK are indicative of good intent, but poor understanding and poor application. So if you haven't seen them, the legally binding, so they're legally binding. So if we're in the UK, I'm pretty sure you're going to be held to account. I have no idea how or when or if, but that is apparently what's going to happen. You're being challenged to halt the decline in species population by 2030, which is an aggressive target. It's not clear what species specifically you want to halt. That's maybe all of them. And then also increase populations by at least 10% to exceed current levels by 2022. A wonderful ambition, but I just think as a target, it's not ticking the smart box for me in any way, shape or form, specific, measurable, achievable, realistic or time-bound. But it's the right intent, but it's not really going after the way. Equally, we're asked to restore precious water bodies to their natural state. And does that include the pond at the bottom of my garden or just Lake Windermere? It's not clear. But also cracking down. So the how is there by cracking down on harmful pollutions from sewers and abandoned mines, etc. And actually, that's fully under the control of the government at the moment. And there's a lot of discussion in the UK about the current state of chalk water and streams, etc. And please do listen to Fergal Sharkey. He's actually right in what he's asking us to do and affect change. We also have to deliver our net zero ambitions and boost nature recovery. So those are two, for me, conflicting challenges that really must be integrated, but they're not necessarily there. But they tell you how to do that by increasing tree and woodland cover to a 16.5% of total land area in England by a certain date. And that's a challenge because a lot of land we have in the UK is committed to agriculture. And we need to continue to commit it to agriculture and not incentivize farmers to stop growing food to feed the growing population unless we address the challenges Jason talked about being more efficient and addressing waste in parallel to that. We want to cut exposure to the most harmful air pollutants to human health, and also restore 70% of degraded features in marine protected areas to favourable condition, whatever that means, by 2042. And I guess for me, that's the challenge. We have a local UK focus here that we're going to be held legally accountable to that doesn't necessarily nest up to some of the activities in other areas in other markets that you're going to have to deliver to. It may be slightly ahead of many, maybe slightly behind others. But it's also very difficult to work out how you're going to go out demonstrating progress or even setting out how you go about achieving those targets that are relevant and material to your own businesses. So I think there's a lot of intent there. There's a lot of good progress in the UK with voluntary targets and mandatory targets, but there's also, and I don't know the collective name for pledges, but you are also going to be asked to sign up to a significant number of diverse pledges on things like nature. And I would encourage you to really investigate them deeply to understand what they're actually asking of you to sign up to and achieve, and whether it's worthwhile for you to be part of that group. I would hope it would be, because they're all very good things, but are you actually able to demonstrate the progress they're expecting of you? And if you don't, how are you going to deal with that from a sort of a reputational basis? So it's just very confusing environment at the moment, and I think approaches where there's a much more common approach across sectors and nations, things like Codex Planetarius are absolutely the right approach, and we can get behind those and see how these local approaches nest up to them, then we can better understand how we can invest in the right activities first.
Thank you, Adrian. So a lot of pledges and some reputational risk if you don't keep up with them. It seems to be the general gist. There's a lot for companies going to keep their heads on. But I mean, it's a moving feast as well. There's the net zero review recently by Chris Skidmore. Is anything more global in that, or is that kind of suffering from the same sort of issues you're talking about now?
Human rights from Ruggy's been out for a very long time. I think that's fairly global. We don't tend to apply it as correctly as we should. There are global approaches out there that they're the right approach. I think net zero is there as a global approach because, again, everyone's agreed the maths, everyone's agreed the target. We absolutely have to take much more quicker action than we currently are. But there are many other challenges, social nature and other environmental challenges we also have to address. And I think the challenge is these standards try and focus on one or the other, prioritize one or the other that are relevant to their own markets, and you have to understand how you can play a role in them specifically. But I think things like the Codex offer a more consistent approach, because I think what's needed for all of this stuff is to ensure we fund the transition. And in all of the asks, from the EU deforestation legislation, from the Green Deal, there's all these wonderful expectations. And with the UK legislation, there's expectations of what will happen, but nobody's funding the change that they are actually asking for. If you want that change to happen, you have to find a way to fund it. The finance markets are actually there. They're trying to help. It's not easy to get the money, to be honest. It's more of an art than a science to get hold of the actual funding. But it's not going to achieve the scale of change that I think is needed, as Jason alluded to, and that's why we need a much more broader approach.
Thank you, Adrian. And just before we come on to Gabriele for the last kind of segment, first of all, actually, just a reminder, everyone, you can ask questions to the panel. We'll have a bit of time at the end, potentially. So do feel free to type in questions. And if we don't handle them today, we'll look at how we can handle them afterwards. But Adrian, just again, I guess this might be one Matteo will have a view on as well. It's that space between kind of global level, investing global level and national level. Also, the UK is also, as a post-Brexit independent trading nation, whatever you want to call it, forging lots of new bilateral trade agreements and some multilateral ones as well in the Pacific. I mean, all of these deals have environmental chapters in them. How important are these environmental chapters going to be, or are they kind of lost again in that space between local action and global?
I don't know, because I think it's the case we have to wait and see what arrangements are being agreed upon and how those environmental things fit together or don't fit together, and what's going to be left outside. Matteo, do you have a view from your side?
So I think with looking broadly at the new generation of trade agreements and the role of sustainability provisions, I think if, again, from my perspective as a researcher, the evidence on the effect of these provisions on the sustainability outcomes that they're targeting is quite limited and not suggesting a robust positive effect. So more and more trade agreements are asked to achieve non-trade objectives, and I think this is a legitimate request, and given the urgency of these challenges, it's important that trade policy finds the best way to play a role there. I think, again, a big open question is to what extent the interaction between trade policy and what is available out there in the population of sustainability initiatives. And we heard that the best of them really made important contributions in providing tools, metrics, ideas, methods, strategies to achieve sustainability objectives. So I think it's important to try and identify the best way for trade policy to maybe go beyond the type of provisions that are recurrent now, and see whether they can leverage the tools, other tools that are developed in the realm of private governance, and see if through them there is the possibility to enhance the effectiveness of trade agreements. So it's a big open question, and measuring or trying to assess the impact of alternative strategies is very challenging. But again, given the urgency of these matters, I think it's important to start experimenting, and there are examples out there of these types of interactions. But again, it's important to
take a specific example. I mean, maybe Jason and Gabriella, you can comment too. I mean, look at the deforestation approaches that are coming through. The EU approach on deforestation, and how well that does or actually does not correlate to the considerations and approaches in Canada, in the US, in China, in the UK, and in Russia. So, if you're importing and or exporting to those countries and you've got some commitments on deforestation, there's not even an agreement about how to do that in the right way across those countries. I mean, Gabriella, from Colombia's perspective, and Jason more broadly, thoughts?
We're still learning, but that's a very good point. And on the deforestation, we can talk about it later. But also, what is a good supplier from a country that is high risk? How does that work? And are you then left out? And then the same for countries. Would that mean that there'll be a two-tier trading system, and one system that caters to EU and the other one? And does that make the change it doesn't make? So it's a very good initiative and start, and we have to go and do while we're learning. But like you say, Adrian, there's a lot of differences. If you're an exporter, to Shemina's point earlier also, that you have to do audits and compliance and requirements to all these customers, and now all these customers in different countries, that's a big load. Definitely for an SME, you're out of the game. But I think even for bigger companies, that also becomes very challenging. Jason?
Yeah, I think I was in Brazil the week before last talking to traders specifically about this issue, and their sense is that what's been created here is a giant segregated system. Now, what that actually means is that this is all the negative aspects of voluntary programs, but the price tag of a much bigger program, because this is just in soy, it's 17% of Brazil's exports going to Europe. And that has to be traced back to the farm, not to an aggregator, through all the independent, indirect suppliers as well. The initial estimates are that this will cost more than either certification of organic product or certification of non-GMO product, and that it could well be 20% additional cost, that none of which will go to the producers, and all of which will be towards the cost of segregation, but I think also towards the profitability of traders, quite frankly. So it's not going to solve the deforestation problem. It's not going to address the producers that are illegal. It's just going to make consumers pay a lot more, feel better that they're not buying deforested product, but they're actually buying embedded carbon from anything that was cleared in the last 20 years. Anyway, even if it's not deforestation today. So there's just a whole lot of things that people aren't aware of that need to be addressed here. Not the least of which is, what is the definition of a forest? A lot of land that has trees on it where you need bulldozers to actually clear it is not considered a forest under this particular ruling. But if you have to bulldoze things into a pile to burn them, that to me is not a grassland per se.
And if I may add to that very quickly, also mindful of time, was speaking about this interlace between what's voluntary, what's mandatory, what can be done there. Are there instruments and tools to tap into to advance this a bit further based on the environment we are in? The one example that can be given, for instance, is the work that in the coffee industry, for instance, there's a platform called the Global Coffee Platform, trying to set up an equivalency system between all of these standards, actually to create a sort of common language, which is also there to facilitate the life of the different supply chain actors. So this is actually the feedback that we're getting. Now, in the context of the deforestation regulation, there are a certain amount of requirements that are there, which are, as we've been just said, relevant or not, or ambitious or not. And actually, one thing that this platform is trying to do, or has done for a long time, is actually deviate from that in terms of cutoff date, for instance, in terms of claims, in terms of substantiation. It's more demanding, it's going further, and it's trying to reduce the cacophony, I would call it like that, between the plethora of initiatives that are there. So initiatives like that, with convergence and being more ambitious, being more demanding in terms of wages protection, labor forces protection, for instance, in the context of smallholder coffee systems, may be useful to change a bit the deal. Now, I think also that one thing that should be looked at is also the amount of the challenges and the failures of all these initiatives. We have a lot of learnings there. There are some opportunities, but there have been challenges there. There have been failures there because of different reasons, because we have no time to go into that. There were deep reasons for that. But we should learn from that, actually, to be trying to create, when I say we, it's a collective we, it's not we, but just in general, there are some tools that can be created and a lot of learning that can be done from this failure. And for instance, maybe also to talk about what Matteo was mentioning about what should be, what to look at exactly when we look at those initiatives. One thing that should never be disregarded is the power asymmetries that are there in supply chains. The power asymmetries, the conflicted norms, the non-relevance to local context, those are risks that have come to the challenges that we all know and the failures that we all know. And maybe this is also food for thought also for thinking about it and avoiding repeating certain mistakes, I would say.
Thank you everyone. That was a really riveting conversation. I am now very conscious of time, so there's one last question I want to put, and it's to Gabriella. I mean, just on a more practical level, I suppose, what do you think are the challenges of suppliers as well as buyers when it comes to compliance with market requirements in addition to regulatory requirements?
Great, I'll try to make it now very concise so we get it. So there are three things. First is the focus. Who gets certified? And I don't remember the numbers. I know Jason talks about this often, but if it's 20% of the bottom that has 80% of the impact, and I don't know, Jason, you can jump in with what are the real numbers. The certification, and me as an SME having to certify, I don't go for that 20%. Why? Because I cannot afford to change that 20%. I go and pick who is already there and then certify them. And this, I'm not the only one. We, for export markets, we are able to pay a premium price. Therefore, we can pick producers that are closer. So the whole system, in a way, it starts with producers that are already there and doesn't make this. So this is a very important thing because it creates, in a way, this two-tier market. And this is a huge challenge. So I'm very much for voluntary standards. I think they set a lot of the issues, the challenges, some of the direction, but the system needs to move beyond that. And one of the things is, to my second point, the regulatory, I really like the Codex Planetarius idea. I think it's because the pre-competitive has been very tough to move, and we need something more. So I think regulatory coming in, we already talked about some of the challenges that we have with the deforestation law in Europe. So it's not going to be easy to get into agreement, but there needs to be some of that. But a big thing on that is the resources, and the resources, now talking from me as an exporter, we're not, the traders, at least the small traders, are not getting the chunk of this. There's a whole system on certification where we're spending a lot of money verifying, accounting, reporting, trading, putting a seal on it, paying for the seal, paying for the inspection. A lot in the system and very limited on the impact. We need to change our business models so that the system is a more efficient system. We have a lot of technology tools. There's a lot that can be done with satellite, Internet of Things, different things that we can lower all this verification, accounting, auditing, reporting costs, and equate that with the more money invested in how we're going to change. If it's just a requirements, it just doesn't work. We need to have the requirements with the willingness to invest, and they need to be connected. And that goes to my third last point, I think, so we hopefully have some time for meetings, which is, how is this on the buyer side? And I know I'm on the exporter side, but I keep proving that we're good exporters. 90% of my time is spent on some of that. And I don't see a lot of the good buyer certifications. Where are the certifications that says this buyers have long-term contracts? These buyers don't cherry pick, they do invest, they have relationships. They are not just transaction, they go into longer term involvement in the supply chain. They are consistent also on the other side. So I think it's the whole system, and how do we evolve now, not just from the requirements. The requirements, if we just put them in the requirements in the current market system, it goes to the weakest point in the chain. Ultimately, who pays is the weakest point that has the lowest negotiation, and we know that that's not on the manufacturers or the traders or the retailer side. It's further up the chain. So if we want to make this happen, we need to be more forceful, maybe the Codex Planetarians, maybe the Levi, and that we reinvest and we connect that. But it needs to be an integrated format, and from the producers, it is a very challenging sphere. And as we pile on more requirements, and now the regulatory, nothing against the intentions of that, but yes, about how do you make that happen.
Thank you so much, Gabriela. Anyone want to interject at this stage? Doesn't look like it. I mean, it's interesting, the points around reducing costs around auditing and that stuff as well, in order to have more to invest in these more sustainable practices. From a trade perspective, we're hearing so much about the inefficiencies in cross-border parts of the supply chain. I think there's some DFDS or did some research about the amount of time a ferry might be in a port waiting for customs clearance for their goods to go over the border, and it's causing tons of emissions. So that feels like an area in terms of, in a trade perspective, if you can reduce the amount of time your goods are stuck at borders and all that stuff as well, that also has an impact too. So the digitalization of trade, which we're reinstituting a lot of work around at the moment, hopefully that can have a role as well in terms of reducing that area of cost and inefficiency. But on that note, there's one last poll actually. I just wanted to have engaged at the start of it, and I wanted to gauge it again. Just wanted to see how comfortable you now feel about the topic of sustainable trade and responsible business. Again, the scale ranks from very comfortable to not at all comfortable. It'll be really interesting to see how this has changed. But at this point, as you're answering that poll, we're going to start wrapping up what has been, I think, a really fascinating and important session. I'd say thank you again to today's speakers in Dr. Jason Clay, Adrian Greet, Dr. Gabriela Alvarez, Professor Sangeeta Kawana, Shamina Amasi, and Dr. Mattea Fiorini for sharing your time, expertise, and wisdom today. A lot for the audience to take in, for sure, but hopefully that introduces some seriously significant and important issues for traders, which have an immediate impact, really. So I hope everyone found that useful. There's some practical guidance in there too, I hope, and hopefully that's been a great introduction for people on this call. Just before I go into our closing slide, just to share the results of that poll. And I think in general, people feel slightly more comfortable than they did at the start of the webinar. Certainly was not at all comfortable anymore. There's a few people still feeling 14% not very comfortable. But yeah, it's still broadly between neutral and quite comfortable in terms of where the audience feels. And hopefully this webinar is it's probably done different things to different people, I'm sure. So thank you everyone again for responding to that poll. On the final side, just a quick plug for an event the Institute is running. The MemberCon is the Institute's main member-driven event featuring a world-class lineup of industry leaders alongside the Institute's excellent experts, covering all things customs and trade. As well as being a great opportunity to network with your fellow exporters and trade professionals, it really is a great chance to put your customs and trade questions to our experts, particularly via a series of Q&A clinics that are taking place throughout the day. It's taking place on 5th July in Liverpool, and you can find out more details on the website, which is export.org.uk. It's been a busy odd month for our webinar program, and we're going to take a break for a couple of weeks, but we'll be back later in June with more sessions on the key trade and customs issues faced by businesses. For updates on our future webinars, please do again visit the website export.org.uk. A reminder that we will be sending a slides and recording of today's webinar to registrants in a follow-up email, which you should get the next day or so. Please do get in touch if for any reason this doesn't come through to your main inbox. But thank you again, everyone, for joining today's webinar. Thank you again to the fantastic panel of speakers. As you leave, please let us know what you thought of today's session and any suggestions for future topics or events by completing the short exit survey. But for now, it's goodbye from me and goodbye from us all, I'm sure. Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.